Hey, good morning, good afternoon. I know we've got some people still joining. We'll give everybody just another minute or so. I know that sometimes they can be hard to get right on time. From a housekeeping perspective, we can use the chat or the Q&A as we go, and we'll try to either answer them in line or as they come, or we'll do some time at the end for Q&A as per kind of the normal format. Today with me I've got Pete Bartz and John Diamond, or JD as some of you might know him, from our solutions architecture team. Our topic is what's new in user-defined REST API polling. It should sound a little bit familiar if you've been coming to the Tech Talks kind of regularly this year. We did, we kind of talked about user-defined polling this summer, and that was based on the functionality in version 20. I'm going to put the link for that in the chat just in case anybody wants to go back and watch that at another time. And so that really focused on the functionality that was available in V20. The focus there was adding attributes to existing Entuity devices or creating custom, right? So pulling in a new single device. What was missing was the ability to look at subcomponents, right? So a way to dig into more complicated devices and display or pull back data about those, right? So with patch 3 of Entuity for version 20 this year, there was an additional release around REST polling, which added a new attribute type for the pollers, right? So instead of just being able to define an attribute for that one device, we could do a subcomponent. And so that adds quite a wrinkle in kind of what we could do here. And so we thought it was worthwhile to come back to this topic again and kind of expand upon where we were and what's capable or possible now that we have the subcomponent, right? I think the use cases were really around centralized controllers or management consoles, right, that have objects underneath, right? But that could mean a lot of things, right? So we're hearing from user community and support tickets and all that kind of stuff, some pretty interesting use cases of where people are looking to deploy this. And so we thought it'd be helpful to kind of walk through it with the guys who are leading some of these efforts and kind of get a feel for what it takes, right, and walk you through it. So kind of the high level, right, from a controller standpoint, when we think about it, or a central management, the easy examples that come to mind are if you think about like a vCenter environment, right, we could pull back data with the V20 about the vCenter itself, right, that device, and relate those. What we couldn't do was create subcomponents for data store containers or NSX objects or vSAN objects, right, because those were underneath the vCenter. You likely could have spent a lot of time building repetitive pollers to get somewhere close, right, for each of those sub-object types, but it would have been ultimately, I think, pretty frustrating. So with this, it'll kind of walk us through how to do that in a more sustainable and usable fashion. So I think we're going to kick to JD first, and I think that the big thing is, so we talked about what REST is last time. We talked about why REST and all that, but I think one of the pieces that we missed was how do we do this, right? So it's, it's GET requests with the web and everything else, and when we think about the what we used to do, right, as far as SNMP and everything, we all kind of have that experience and knowledge of how to attack, right? But with REST, what changes, right? How do we do it, JD, right? What's the approach?
Okay, well, the very first thing that is important to understand is that you've got to do your research. So let me just show you how I went about that in this particular example, where we're going to be looking for vCenter data stores. So if we were to take a look here, this is some of VMware's documentation, and I'm going to focus on two parts of it. First of all, and this is not atypical of many REST API implementations on various equipment, and that is that the authentication you need to use is not going to be a straightforward basic authorization with a login and password. It's actually a two-step approach. The first step is to obtain a session ID, and that is going to be maintained within a cookie that is set up when you obtain this. So there's an API call that is issued to create a session. If you look at their documentation, it gives you the full details on how to go about doing that, and it returns the session ID in a cookie. Then once you've got that, then you can start making use of it. And if we take a look at their documentation, and I'm actually working with an older vCenter, mine's 6.5, and so I'm using their older documentation because VMware changed their API quite substantially at version 7, so be aware of that. Here, I'm going to look down to the vCenter portion of their documentation. And here you'll see they've got a complete section on data store information. So if we were to list or go in here, you're going to see that they've got two operations. In reality, for what I want, we only really need to look at this first one, the list data store. And if I were to scan all the way down to the bottom here, you're going to see that now various things that can be pulled back when you issue that call are the capacity and the free space of a data store and its name and its type. So all critical information, basic information, but very important information that's going to enable us to see how full each data store is. So armed with that information, I'm able to move forward and actually start creating it. So here I'm going to go to the Entuity UI, and all of the administration of the user-defined pollers are through the administration menu. Down here, you'll see that there is the user-defined REST polling section, not to be confused with the user-defined SNMP section. And under pollers, you will see I've got absolutely no pollers established. So I'm going to build one. I'm going to create the poller, and all the sections that we're moving through here are controlled via tabs in the UI. We're going to be going from left to right in general terms. And I say that because there are some caveats to that, and I'm going to point those out in detail when we get there. So to begin with, top level information, we're going to need to give this poller a name. How about vCenter data store? Now you notice I didn't put any spaces in there. Spaces are not allowed. If you put one in, it's going to complain at you. So no spaces here. I'm going to use that as the display name, and that you are allowed spaces. So I'm going to take the opportunity to do that. May as well put that in for the description. Naturally, you could be more verbose in your system. The next thing is going to be the context type. Is this going to be for any old fully managed device? No, it's not. This is going to be very specifically for the type of device that the vCenters are classified as. And if you were to look down the list, you would find of all of the various different types, we've got VM platform. The virtual management platform is the relevant type in this case. vCenters, when we take them under management, are considered to be a VM platform. Now, this is where we deviate from the functionality that was originally in the general availability release of version 20. You now have a choice. Do you just want to obtain attributes to go on to that device? Or are you interested in creating and maintaining and polling into subcomponents? And that's what we're going to do here. We're going to take advantage of this subcomponent capability because each data center, not a data center, a data store is going to be represented as a subcomponent of the vCenter. These are going to be visible. We're going to have it polling every 5 minutes, and at 5-minute polling, we can keep up to 2 weeks. So what I'm going to go ahead and allow it to maintain 2 weeks worth of data. If you are polling at a slower rate, you can keep it for much longer. Okay, so we've got that set up. Now, the next thing you need to set up is which devices this is going to apply to. Now, I've already got a vCenter under management. I've got it set up so that we're doing our standard polling of it, which is pulling in information about the virtual machines and the vSwitches and the virtual network interfaces. That's through the SOAP interface that was originally supported on the vCenter. It's still supported, but that predated REST implementations. So I'm going to add a device. The one here is that one. And so that is already available for me as I've already taken it under management. By the way, this checkbox here is simply there to allow you to nominate which you want to remove, if you want to remove any. It's nothing to do with actually having it under management. So it's only there to aid you in choosing which devices you want to remove at a later date.
JD,
Now I'm going to
couldn't
hit.
you do? Sorry, couldn't you do the negative match? Right. So I've seen that where, you know, if we want this poller to match all devices of a type, right, and
You
always be
certainly
applicable.
can. And this advanced filter allows you to actually put in a filter mechanism to choose which devices are to be considered for use with this poller rather than individual ones. So you are correct there, Jordan. There's the filter, which would be the way to go for that.
Perfect.
Okay, I'm going to, at this point, get out of that by turning off the option here, and then use the next button to get me onto the next step. Now, these next buttons are important. They have two roles. One is to save the changes you've just made, and the other is to move you on to the next part of the workflow. It's important because you could jump around up here, and there are consequences. If you've made some changes and you don't hit the next button, you haven't necessarily saved all of the work you've done. And you need to be very much aware of that because that can get you into deep water. So we're on to the steps. It's important to note that as we're polling the sub-objects, we now have 3 possible steps. One is going to be the setup step that we're going to use to obtain that session ID. The next will be to discover the individual sub-objects representing each of the data stores. And finally, we're going to poll various attribute contents to flesh out that so that we have information about each data store. So let's start with the new setup step. That's what it's going to be called by default, and frankly, I think that's a pretty good name. I'm going to leave it untouched. I could change it, but I'm not going to. The credential mode. Now, these credentials, as it states here, are only used during the design phase. That's what I'm in at the moment, but they are required for this. This is not a runtime setting. That will be set separately. It is worth noting that I've already set up on the device not only the credentials to use for regular polling, but also I've set up a section which is for the user-defined polling. Don't forget that. If you don't set that up, then at runtime, this is not going to work. So here for the credential, I've set up a credential set already, the one I'm going to be using for the vCenter, so I'm going to take advantage of it. This operation to obtain the session ID is not a get, it's actually a post, but we're not going to be posting any information to the vCenter. It's an empty body that's going to be sent to it. The URL that is going to be used, I've already obtained that from the documentation from VMware. And so here I'm going to paste that in. And it obtains the session ID. The host and port are used at runtime, not at the design phase, which is what we're in at the moment. Host is used to replace that portion of the URL when it actually comes to the runtime issuing of this request. The host is taken from the name of the device as listed for general management purposes. It's important to note that must therefore be resolvable. If your name is not resolvable, this URL will fail at runtime. Port is provided in case you were to want to deviate from the natural port, the native port for, in this case, HTTPS. If you put HTTP, it will default to 80. HTTPS will default to 443. If you want anything else, you're going to need to code it in here. The body is going to be empty because this does not require us to give it anything, and we're not going to use any special headers. So that's all we're going to need. But what I can do before we go any further is to give it a quick test. And this is going to go and request that session ID. This is the session ID that was returned. And critically importantly, you'll notice that it also set up this cookie. That was done by the that API call from the vCenter. That cookie is going to linger in the poller and allow us to do the rest of the polling. That will be authenticated through the cookie. Okay, so we've now got it. At this point, it would be very tempting to go straight to setting up a discovery step, but don't do it. You've got to remember to hit the next. That takes you on to the next tab up at the top here, but we actually need to go back to the steps in order to set up the discovery. We're going to be working on making that a little more tolerant in the future, but at the moment, be aware that you must remember to hit the next after every change that you make. Going to the new discovery, again, that's a decent name. I'm not going to change it. At this point, we're going to need to set up a component type. This is the component for the data store. And frankly, what's better than just saying data store? I'm going to call it data store. The display name, I can be a little more descriptive here. How about vCenter data store? And I may as well just copy that down into the description as I've got nothing better to put in there. We're going to have this visible. There's no reason to make it in any way hidden. That has set up this new type of component to represent a data store. We're not going to make any changes to the parent discovery step. The purpose of this is where you've got a multi-level hierarchy. If, for example, there were subcomponents of a subcomponent that I wanted to discover and poll, I would need to be creating multiple levels, at which point I would need to be defining which level each component belonged to. That's the job of the parent discovery step. This does not require the use of the credentials from the device. It's going to rely upon that cookie. So I can just turn that off. It's going to be a get. And once again, I've already prepared that syntax for the URL. Again, that was taken from the documentation from VMware, and I'm going to paste that in. At this point, we're going to rely upon that the name of the device, which I've already got set up within the definition for the device itself. That's going to be adequate for my polling. And we don't need to set up any special headers. So let's see whether that works. Having already run that setup step using the test, that cookie is already in existence. I'm now going to leverage it. I'm going to hit a test, and we're going to see the results. This is what came back. Here was that cookie obtained from the setup step, and this is the JSON body that came back from the operation I've just performed. And each section within here, that's the first section within this list, defines a data store. Here's the first data store. That was its name. It's of type VMFS. That's its capacity in bytes. That's its free space in bytes. And then we've got all of the other data stores defined in a very similar manner. Okay, that's working. That's good news. These test buttons are worth their weight in gold. Okay, moving on. Do not forget, hit the next button. You've gone on to the next step, but we can come back. There is something I did omit at this point, and I'm going to come back and do it right now. With the discovery, there is a secondary portion of this that you need to set up. If we were to go next and then skip over, in fact, using the next button, skip up to the attributes section, there are two attributes defined for a discovery step. One is the index and one is the name. Anyone who's used our SNMP user-defined poller will be familiar with this concept. The index is used to figure out which of the sub-objects we're referring to, and the name is going to be obtained from that to name the sub-object. So these are critical attributes that are mandatory. Let's begin and set up the index. To do this, I've selected it and I'm going to edit. And this allows both sections here to be obtained. One is going to identify the parent section of the within that JSON body that was returned, and the other is going to be the path within it representing the actual subcomponent, in this case the data store. So here with the parent source path, I'll explore the parent path, and it is that top level, this thing called value, that I'm going to need. So I'm going to select it and then go and explore the path. If I open up one of these, this returned 6 data stores. If you look at them, they're all identical. They've just got a different index number on them. Each one has an identification, a name, that type, the free space, and the capacity. I'm going to use that bit here, the data store, which is a unique ID for each one, as the index. So let's select it and say done. I've got the top level parent and the index defined here. Moving on to the name. If I were to edit that and explore the path, I can open up one of the data stores. I only need to concern myself with one because they've got identical formats. And at this point, I'm going to choose this, which is identified as name, which is the way I want it named. So I'm going to take that and say done. That'll be the part of that JSON body we're going to use to name the data store. Okay, that's all set up. Don't forget to hit the next. Okay, I've not finished. Although I'm at the end of the list, I've not finished. I'm going to go back to steps. We've got the individual data stores being discovered. If I were to stop at this point, go have a cup of coffee, come back and look at what's been discovered, I would find, particularly if I'd gone to the summary and hit save at the end, that it would have discovered my data stores. But I'm going to continue onto the polling step. Again, I'm going to leave it named as it is. What component is this going to apply to? It's going to be that one I've just defined, the data store. That was defined in step number 2. I've got a choice here. Do I have to issue a separate REST request for each and every data store, or will one single request return all of the information I need for all of them? In this example, one request returns everything, so I don't need to issue a separate one per. It all depends upon the nature of the API you're working with. So I'm going to switch it over here, single request. And again, credential-wise, I'm not going to be using credentials. I'm going to be relying upon that cookie, so I can turn that off. It's going to be a get. It's going to be the very same URL that we used previously in the discovery step, and everything else applies as it did before. So that has set up the polling step. I haven't defined any attributes yet, but it's set up the polling. Again, hit the next and use the next to step you through up to the attributes. I'm not taking advantage of this parameterized or variable arrangement. I talked about this last time we did the tech talk. This allows you to break apart, in this case, the URL. You see here, the URL was /rest/vcenter/datastore. This has broken it into sections, and you can dynamically replace parts of this with computed values or values obtained from a previous step. So with that said, we'll leave all of that alone. I'm going to go to the attributes. We currently have no attributes, so I want to set some up. I'm going to add the first one. I'm going to go look at that JSON body that we've already got. Because I hit the test button previously, it's already available to me. If I were to go in and take a look at one of these data stores, let's say that I want to obtain the type. That's just a string indicating the type of the data store. I've selected it, and so it's put type into the source path. That's what it's using to name it, and it just capitalized it at the beginning there for the display name. You can change that if you want, but the critical thing here is that defines how it's going to pull that information out of the JSON body. It's an octet string. I'm going to leave that alone, display it as a string. No need to change any of this. It's going to be visible. That's fine. All of the defaults are good. We've set up pulling and setting up that attribute for the type, and it's going to be displayed as a string. I'm going to add another one. Now let's go in, and I'm going to get the capacity. Okay, here it is. I've selected it. Again, it's set up the source path. That's defined how it pulled it out of the JSON body. The name and display name was set up accordingly. I do not want this treated as a string. I want this handled numerically. So here, if I were to look down the various different data types we've got available, I'm going to choose unsigned 64. So that's a 64-bit unsigned number, which will be ample. 32 wouldn't be big enough, potentially. So 64 will be ample for holding that value. The next thing is, how do we want it displayed? Well, I really don't want this displayed as an absolute byte count. That would be very difficult to comprehend. As this is going to be in the megabytes or terabytes, I want this interpreted as a memory value. And we actually have already an option here called memory that will interpret it and display it in a human readable form. You'll see the effect of that in a moment. Okay, so that's capacity. Again, everything else here can be left default. It is going to do the job for what we want. That set up the capacity. I'm going to do the very same thing here for the free space. Let's go in once again, get the free space, and I'm going to do the same thing, unsigned 64, and I'm going to call it a memory type so that we get it displayed in a meaningful manner. That's all well and good. That would be good enough. Basic information coming from that data store. However, I don't know about you, but I personally would rather, instead of these enormous numbers, I would like to see it represented as a percentage utilized.
Me too.
Okay, so let's go about it. That information is not available directly from the JSON body. It's not in there, but we have the information necessary to compute it. That can be easily computed given the capacity and the free space. So that's what I'm going to do. I'll add in, at this point, I'm going to hand add the name utilization. And let's call it utilization. I'll put a capital U. The interesting bit comes in the source path. I'm not going to pull this directly from the using the data explorer because it's not a single value that I want. I'm going to take advantage of some syntax that allows me to pull bits and pieces and do whatever I want with them. I'm going to begin with $open curly bracket. And you'll see a menu has dropped down here. There are many different types of information that I can obtain. I'm going to go for source, which means it's going to pull from the JSON body. If you look down here, I want to take the free space. Now I'm going to take that. This is the free space of the first data store. That's the free space of the second data store, etc. Not quite what I want. I just want the free space of the current data store. So I'm going to take out the bit at the beginning, just leaving me with free space. So source : free space. If you take the free space and divide it by the capacity, let's again, open curly bracket. We're going to go for the capacity. Again, I'm going to take that initial bit out. So I'm not tying it to a specific data store. It's the current data store that it's looking at. That gives me the proportion of the data store that is going to be available. I don't want a proportion, I want a percentage. So let's simply multiply it by 100 at the beginning. The spaces aren't mandatory. I've just put them in for style. So that gives me the percentage free space, which is almost but not quite what I asked for. I wanted the percentage utilization, not the free space. So I'm just going to take the whole thing away from 100. And that will give me the percentage utilization. As far as the way to store it, I want to store that as a floating point number. The highest precision we support here is a 64-bit floating point number. So let's do that. And when it comes to presenting it in the user interface, you'll see that we've actually got some percentage options. I'm going to constrain the number of decimal places. 2 should be adequate. Let's put that in. And that, if I were to hit the done button, could be the end of the story. But I want to do one more thing. If a data store utilization goes above a threshold, I want to be alerted about it. We've got event generation capability as well. Down the bottom here, you'll see there's the event mode. If I pull down the menu, you can see it can either look for a threshold crossing or a status value. This is going to be a threshold crossing. And down the bottom, it then invites me to add an event mapping. I'm going to do so. Down here, the map value, we've got 4 values. These first 3 are high going values. If it goes above these thresholds, it's going to generate the event. The final one is a low going. If it goes below that one, it's going to generate the event. I may as well just stick with the default, which is critical, which is a high going threshold. And I need to define it. I'll need to add one in. Let's call it data store utilization. No spaces allowed. You can put underscores in if you want, but I'm just going to keep it like that. Going to give it a name. That does allow a space, so I'm going to put one in. And once more, I can use that for the description, or I could be more descriptive if I wanted to. You can group thresholds together. Let's group this together under a name data store. The unit that is going to be relevant in this case, this is a percentage. So I'm just going to put percent in because that's effectively the unit. Minimum and maximum, well, frankly, 0 to 100 is a pretty good range. I'm going to leave those default. What default value would I want for my threshold? 90% sounds reasonable to me. So let's stick 90 in here. And it will be enabled by default. I could have it disabled by default, so you have to turn them on, but I'm going to leave that enabled by default. Okay, so these are going to be set at 90% by default, and they can be set anywhere in the range 0 to 100. Okay, that's set it up. Down the bottom here, we've got that data store utilization, going to generate a critical user-defined threshold-based event if it gets crossed. That's done. And finally, hit the next button. In the summary section, you can go down here and take a quick look. I'm going to give you a quick bit of advice, and that is to look at this bit, the API path. You'll see it has been set up here in step 2, and that got set up in step 3. For some reason, it's missing here in my setup step. That sends an alarm bells in the back of my mind ringing. I've goofed at some point. I need to go back and deal with that. By the way, we're going to be more tolerant of that in the future. But at this point, I'm going to deal with that because this is something you might run into yourself. I'm going to go back to the steps. I'm going to go back to the setup. I'm going to look down here. And in order to force that to be set up, I'm actually going to make a dummy change. I'm arbitrarily going to put a change to that URL, hit next. I'm going to go back to the steps, and I'm going to take that little change out. And that was just to force it to recalculate that API path. Hit next, and we'll go all the way to the summary, take another look down here. Here we are. I've corrected the issue. The API path now has a value. So it's important. When you get to the summary, have a quick scan down here. And the thing that I would recommend you pay particular attention to is that every step must have an API path completed, or else it's just not going to work. Okay, so at this point, you can hit the save, which will commit the whole thing to operate. You'll see it is enabled, and everything is set up. All the steps are set up. Now, I could go away and have a cup of coffee, but we haven't got time for that. So as in all good cookery programs, I've got one I prepared earlier. Over here, if I were to go in and take a look at this device, this is the regular polling that we do for vCenters, identifying the hypervisors and the virtual switches. But at this point, if I were to go to the associations dashboard, you will see that among the various different associations, there's a new one here for data store. That's the one I created. And these are the 6 different data stores that it found with all of those values, including the computed utilization value. Furthermore, if I were to actually drill down to this one, you see it's got an open incident. That is because I had gone in and manually overrode the threshold down to 80. That was currently has a utilization of around 83%. And about an hour ago, I dropped it to 80 to force it to generate the event. That was the event that was generated. It's a user-defined attribute value critical event. If you wanted a more specific event for this particular purpose, you could put a rule in place within the event management system to detect that and convert it to your custom event that you want generated. But fundamentally, this has generated the event, which would generate a corresponding incident. And again, if you were coding this specifically within the event management system, you could do that coding. At which point, I think it's time to hand over to Pete, who's going to show you how this information can be then leveraged within dashboards to make better use of it. So Pete, do you want to take over?
Absolutely. Thanks, JD. And good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'll share my screen out. JD, isn't it just as easy just to use the association dashboard to see all the data? Why wouldn't that work?
You can, but frankly, it's a bit clunky. The associations dashboard isn't really there for use by people in the operations center. That is there for administrators to see how things are related to each other within Entuity. If you want to use it on a regular basis, I think it's really better to customize a dashboard to make it easily available at your fingertips.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that as well. Now, what you've done is you've made a fundamental change to the modeling and monitoring for a VM platform. So, looking at the same vCenter that you're monitoring in your environment, I've got it set up on my server as well. And if I take a look at the summary dashboard, again, the only way to get access to the data is to go down to associations and then drill into that. So it would make sense to actually make a modification to that default summary dashboard and include the data someplace. So I think let's do that. So I'll walk you through an example on how you can do that. And I'm going to introduce a couple concepts that folks may not be as aware of, and that's using the Dropbox to actually facilitate adding metrics into a specific dashlet. We're going to create a table dashlet. I think similar to the virtual switches, let's create a table that is looking at all of the individual data stores. So the first thing to look at is, I've got this summary dashboard. I need to create some real estate because I'm filling up the screen. But I do like pretty much everything that's in here. I could see maybe taking the latency latency chart out and replacing that with a table, or maybe move some things around. But ultimately, I'd like to use this as my starting point. So similar to any dashboard configuration, using an existing dashboard as a starting point is as easy as making a duplicate of it. So we're going to do that. Now, one concept that I want to talk about is, and I do this when I'm working with customers, is we'll create a dashboard. We might name it something custom. So I could call this summary data stores. We'll have a totally separate dashboard that is focused on my vCenter as well as the data store information. But because I'm actually adding the data stores in for all of my vCenters that I might have under management, I'd rather have the default dashboard pick up that behavior. And I can actually override the existing summary dashboard that you see here by creating a brand new dashboard and just call it the same name. So we're going to create a dashboard and we're going to call it summary. It's going to look a lot like the existing vCenter dashboard, but we're going to make some modifications into it where we're picking up the individual data stores. So the concept here is if you have a dashboard that's the same name, it can actually have a higher precedence where it will override the out-of-the-box behavior. So I haven't deleted or made a modification to the out-of-the-box dashboard. I've just created a brand new one and said, use this one instead. So I've set the name, and pretty much everything else in here is going to be the same as what that initial dashboard is. It's a dynamic dashboard, so it's going to pick up the context that I'm focusing on. I'm going to apply it to a VM platform type, and I'm going to leverage all the out-of-the-box behavior. Now, one thing that I trip up on, other people trip over as well. When you create a dashboard, don't forget to set the user group. By default, the user access is set to nothing, to no access at all. So if I save this, I'd actually get an error saying, you need to give somebody access to it. But when you're setting these up, always remember to give the proper groups access to the dashboard, whoever's authorized to see it. Now, in my case, I'm just going to use the administrators group. And because I'm replacing that summary dashboard, it's going to be a favorite. So I'm going to hit done here. I'll set up the dashboard, and I'm now in the dashboard editor for that brand new summary dashboard. Now, I could take the latency chart out, or I do like the latency, so I'm just going to make some real estate. Make a little bit of space. Let's move some things around. I'm going to slide latency over here, and we'll just squeeze this down. And we're going to put a table in here that shows the data stores. So to do that, let's just add a dashlet. Again, this table dashlet is going to leverage my current context. So it's going to leverage the context that's in the dashboard, which is going to be this one right here. So I'll just hit next, and we'll scroll down the list of dashlets and just go down to a table. All right, now let's set this one up. Table as a name, you could probably pick a little bit better name. Let's call this data store. If I can spell, here we go. Get rid of the capital A. Again, it's going to use the dashboard as a source. It's going to apply to a VM platform. Perfect, because I want to see the data stores for this specific platform. I'm going to include objects of a type. Now, JD set up the type when he set up the discovery and the attributes and the entire configuration for the polling. And the type that he used was called data store. So what I want to be able to do is leverage that same type, that same component type that's been added into the system. So I'm not going to use a port. I'm just going to select the dropdown, and I'm going to look for data store. Now, it's not in my list of sort of out-of-the-box favorites. But if I go down to show more, I can certainly find it. I could scroll through all the existing types, or I'm just going to type data, and it's going to highlight data store. So I'm including data store objects in this table, but I need to tell the system where I'm getting those data store objects from, because I only want to look at the objects that are related to a specific VM platform. So instead of having this set up as none, I actually want to be able to identify the data store objects that are a child of a platform. So this will actually say, look at this as my vCenter, and then show me the data stores that are part of it. Now, I could go through here and add in column by column by column and add in all the attributes. But I'd like to do it a little bit easier. I'd actually like to use the concept of a Dropbox. So what we're going to do is I'm going to hit select my other attribute here, or my other dashboard, and I'm going to look at vCenter, and we're going to build a Dropbox. So JD showed you where to get the list of the data stores, and that's looking at the associations dashboard. So I'm seeing a list of all the data stores, and I'm actually going to build a Dropbox for each one of these metrics. Now I'm going to do it really simply. I'm just going to select an example, select one data store, and go down to the attributes dashboard. I'm seeing all the attributes that have been added into the system. I've got capacity, we've got the display name, we've got the type, we've got the available free space, and the calculated utilization. I'm just going to control click each one of these. And tell it to add to a Dropbox. So you see I've got 5 elements in my Dropbox right now. And I'm going to actually use these to fill in the columns that are going to be in that table. Now, one thing that you can do with the Dropbox is if you're looking at time series data, you can build a Dropbox. You can save it as a template, and you can come back to it later. Or if I want to just do this as a kind of a troubleshooting exercise where I want to look at specific metrics, I can pick all of my performance metrics and just show them on a chart. So you can use the Dropbox to populate reports. You can use the Dropbox to populate dashboard configurations, and you can use the Dropbox to dynamically look at specific attributes. I'm going to save this. Let's go back to the other dashboard that we've got. And if I select the Dropbox, you see I've got all 5 attributes here. I'm going to use all 5 of these in my table. So we'll just select these and hit add. So again, I could add columns individually. The Dropbox makes it a whole lot easier. Now let's just move some things around. Let's put the display name on top. Just drag these columns kind of up and down to the order that we want to be able to have. Put the type next, capacity, free space, utilization. This looks pretty good. I'm going to hit done. Let's make a little bit of space. And because I'm actually focused on a vCenter, let's just preview this. That looks pretty good. Again, you can move things around, make more real estate. You could change the key info dashlet to squeeze it up a little bit higher to make real estate, but this is a really easy way to add in a table into an existing dashboard. Now, if I save this, and I'm going to go exit it, I'm focused on my dashboard, or focused on my vCenter, and I'm just looking at the out-of-the-box standard summary dashboard, but you can see that I've overridden that now to include the data store. So this is a really easy way to, expose data, whether you're getting it from SNMP polling, whether you're getting it from the REST API polling, any attributes that are added into the system or existing in the system, making custom dashboards to be able to visualize that data can be really helpful. Now I'll show you another example, because as a display name, I could select a data store, and effectively it's not telling me a lot of information. It is giving me the current readings for the performance metrics. But maybe what I want to be able to do is chart the data stores, chart each one of them to be able to see what it is historically. Especially JD showed that one of them went over a threshold percentage. So, what's the history of utilization for that specific data store? I created another dashboard, again, focused on just the vCenter. I just called this one a data store list. This is just listing out the individual data stores, very similar to the table that we just built. But in this case, this is actually populating a chart of the data, the last 24 hours worth of data dynamically for each data store. So this is another example of something where you could build this. It could be very useful to be able to look at history and be able to expose that data. I think that's about it for the dashboard section. Jordan, I'll turn it back. Are there any questions or any other topics?
Yeah, so I was going to say, so Pete, we got free dashboarding, right? We were planning for UD polling, and we got a nice dashboarding demo, so that's helpful. I know that the monitoring is data collection, right? That's an important part in thresholds, but if we can't visualize it, it starts to not have as much value as we would want, right? So that's helpful to have that. We did get a question around how do we synchronize these, right? So if I've got multiple Entuity servers, maybe in a single environment, or maybe different environments like a pre-prod and production, right? Obviously, we're all test here, but how would somebody go about doing that, right? Do they have to redo this on every Entuity server?
Well, I'll tell you what. In fact, in our case, I developed the original REST poller for the data store. I got it all working on my system, and rather than Pete having to do it all again himself, I exported that and sent it over by email to Pete to install it. So I can show you how I did that. We've got some extensions in our own API that allow that to happen. So let me show you what that looks like. Here we go. Right, I'm using Postman. Postman is a readily available REST API manipulation tool, and I'm going to use it to access our API to get hold of that configuration that I've set up. That's performed using a GET. All of our API operations are documented online, and this will be my own system here. I'm not running HTTPS, so that's just http:// and then my system's running as localhost. API, the function is called UD for user defined, and then polars. I want the output in JSON, media equals JSON, and we will be able to get that if I give it an authorization header. So here, my login was admin. I'll enter my password and see what we get back. So it came back with good status. Look at the body that came back, and this is all of the definition of all the polars, the REST API polars that I've already got. This is the one that was from the previous Tech Talk. That was polling some weather statistics. And we got another one that I put in for test purposes, and this was the vCenter data store polar. This was number 5, polar ID 5. Now that's critical because that isn't the be all and end of that polar definition. That's only the top level definition of it. I need to get all of the details of polar number 5. I'm going to do that by putting an extra bit onto the URL, put a /5 at the end of it here, and I'm going to issue that as a GET. That has now returned me all of the information about polar number 5, which includes all of the steps. So we got every step here, the setup step, the discovery step, and the polling step. Everything here is defined. In order that that can be, go ahead.
Yeah, just to interrupt, because we're tight on time, and I think we're probably gonna have to follow up with a doc on this. But Kevin Kevin had a question. Does this work for the SNMP polar, UD polar also?
No, it doesn't. This is specifically and only for the REST polar.
Okay.
Just want to point out that you mustn't give the entire body to the next step. You're going to want to take this section, ignore the beginning, start here, go down all the way to the line before the end. You don't want that last bracket. So you want that section, copy that out, and then I would hand that over to whoever's going to use it. And there is an equivalent post operation where you don't give it an ID number. That will be generated at runtime. You just give it the UD polars and post that portion of the body, and that will set it up on the other system.
Yeah, I think this will be a great great add to the support site or whatever, just from a document, because that multi-server environments can be tricky, right?
I think one thing to look at too is, because JD sent me that configuration, and here I'm just going to show you. Here's what my post configuration was in Postman. So I used that exact file, set up the proper authorization, and then posted that into my server. So you can see, this is the server that I'm actually did that initial configuration on. So I didn't have to do it all by itself. But I think, Jordan, going back to the original question, is if you've got a multi-server configuration, so you've got a consolidation server, you've got 20 polling servers, how do you replicate this across all of them? And I think that's something that that's a really good thing to be able to share, because in a multi-server environment, as you build, see if I look at, let's take a look at, yeah, I've got it right here. So here's the polling configuration in a multi-server environment. As you build this configuration, it's automatically going to synchronize to all of the children that are connected to this. So you would normally set this up on a consolidation server, then allow it to synchronize automatically into the rest of the pollers that you've got. So it's going to do that automatically. Now, in my case here, you can actually see I've got a synchronization issue. I've got 2 servers in a multi-server environment. One of them was actually offline when I built this. So you may have a server that's down. It may not be connected into the configuration for some reason. You might have built a new one later, but effectively it's not synchronizing. Now, the only time it synchronizes is when you actually do that last save. When you're at the summary and you hit a save, it's going to push it out to all the children. But I've got a problem here. So let's actually go back to the other server that I've got. While JD was talking, I brought this up. And you can see on my other server in a multi-server configuration, I don't actually have that config. So this is really easy to fix. All I need to do is go to the polling server here. Now, I mean, I don't know which server. So if I've got, like some of our large customers, you may have 20, 30, 40, 50 servers hanging out here. You don't know which ones aren't being a problem. If you want to see which servers are having an issue, go to the triple dot menu for the dashboard. Just go to configuration columns. And at the bottom, you'll see a checkbox here for missing servers. I'm going to select that, and it's actually telling me which server's got a problem. Now, to fix this, I'm just going to select this, edit the poller. I'm not going to make any other changes. I just want to synchronize it. So I'm going to go all the way over to the summary, hit save. It's automatically synced itself. My syncing issue is no longer a problem. And if I go to my other server directly, just refresh my browser window and you're going to see that I've got it in place. So this is the auto syncing for this is a really nice component, and it's really easy to troubleshoot.
Thanks for that, Pete and JD. I know this was a denser, more technical deep dive this time, so we ran a little bit over and didn't have as much time for kind of the back and forth. But if anybody has any questions, feel free to drop us an email, and I'm sure Susan will communicate some follow-on detail when we have any additional documentation from this or anything like that. So and keep an eye out for the recording. It'll get posted on the website just as soon as we can get it edited. So thanks so much, and have a great day, everyone.